Thanks, everyone. Judith Butler once commented on ACT UP's die-in protest model. She noted that the ACT posed a set of questions without giving you the tools to read off the answers. And I want to think about John Ashbery's collection, Eight Galleons, from 1987, which revises and negotiates and reimagines and imbues with meaning prevailing 1980s narratives about HIV/AIDS, kind of in a similar light as posing a set of questions without necessarily giving you the tools to read off the answers. Because it's not an easily legible or in any way epiphanic account of personal or collective experience. Instead, it deploys a sort of taxonomy of slippages and imprints and impressions and digressions and disruptions and traces in order to ask different kinds of questions about the complexities of enduring and surviving and articulating what Ashbery calls the unreconstructed story of AIDS. Eight Galleons is difficult in that it's not easy, but Samuel R. Delaney, in writing about AIDS as well, suggests that disease can be read as a kind of dis-ease or non-easiness. And this, I think, is something that Ashbery enacts in his poems, this idea of dis-ease, endeavouring to capture things that are not easy to capture, to articulate things that are really difficult to articulate, things that are not known, not least the incoherence of grief. It's of course long been acknowledged that the HIV/AIDS crisis elicited a crisis of language, and Eight Galleons, in grappling with this crisis of articulation, offers a written record into which this crisis is imprinted. Each of the 53 poems in the collection shares a preoccupation with what really feels like a devastating business of reconciling and comprehending HIV/AIDS as something that in 1987 is at once everyday but also incomprehensible. And Ashbery in the text often appears gripped with a really fraught preoccupation with writing about HIV/AIDS. And I'll just go through and just kind of give some quotations from the text just to give a sense of how I read it. So he's preoccupied with breathing our very own unedited tale of how it happened, of each step that led away from childhood to the bounteous past before us now. So much to think over, and even worse, write a report on. Such a preoccupation is diffuse. Eight Galleons is concerned, I think, with creating a record for the steep times to come, in the knowledge that such an effort is likely to be beset by failure. Sure enough, even as the story ended, its shadow vanished. But the poems reveal themselves to be multiply concerned with the weight of incomprehension and pain and grief, in lines like "Dreams I had, including suicide," with being unable to look while simultaneously wanting to bear witness to the unmaking of the world. I will do this, I can do no more, I cannot think on the edge of a platform. With the rituals and magical thinking involved with envisioning a cure. Unless we omitted something, and we did, it'll cure it, it will have to, but I can't whisper that story yet. And also with the ethics and anxieties and guilt and practicalities of going on and writing about going on in the midst of catastrophe. So from the poem Posture of Unease, "But for all you I have neglected, ignored, left to stew in your own juices, not been that friend that is approaching, I ask forgiveness, a song new like rain, please sing it to me." The poems also express a fear that no one will read or care about the account that's being set down. It feels like little more than a bottle with a note in it that washes up on shore and no one sees it, no one picks it up. Eight Galleons is preoccupied, I think, with attempting to acquire the knotty navigational skills and tactics needed not just to think about the unthinkable, but to work out what to say about it, how to react, how to respond. The story blows away, Ashbery writes, and what can you do howling without a script? Michel Foucault remarked shortly before his death from AIDS, he said, "You always think that in a certain kind of situation you'll find something to say about it, and now it turns out there's nothing to say after all." And I think For me, April Galleons feels like Ashbery's attempt to figure out what to say. He writes, "Will we always be speechless to the end, unable to say the familiar things?" Perhaps, but as he writes in the poem, when half the time they don't know themselves, there has to be a heart to this. The words are there already. Andrew Holleran recalls that during the crisis, no one could see the way out. And although the windows are opaque, April Galleons in some ways is poetry that tries to see a way out. The title of the collection, for me, evokes the angular, multi-sailed ships, armed ships of the age of sail and exploration, which were at once pointed agents of adventure into the unknown, of discovery and conquest and camaraderie at sea, but also, of course, of subjugation and bloodshed and peril and death. Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, T.S. Eliot, and Audre Lorde, among others, have taught us to be chary of Aprils. And Ashbery's spring ships align themselves with the dread and the cruelty and sacred knowledge of death found in those prior iterations of the illusory nature of seasonal renewal. These galleons are sailing into darkness, the speedometers at sundown. April Galleons enact a form of queer grief, informed, and I quote, informed by life lived after the historical accumulation of queer deaths, a collection of losses that have taught us to know, because our survival depends on this knowledge, that we are also standing before losses that have yet to come. But it also, in this sense of, in its sense of being in a state of perpetual instability, evokes seasickness, a contingent malady triggered by the loss of the earth, the same earth into which ordinarily we sink our feet. And yet that borderline of uncertainty, that sense of the lost earth, simultaneously allows for the possibility that spring can also simply be spring, that it can be beautifully incomprehensible, that it can also represent, if we wish, new beginnings, new dawns, new hopes, just as we might also read the poems for or as queer vessels written into being in order to transport us somewhere better. And the final poem in the collection, April Galleons, performs for me just such a kind of unpredictable nautical journey that has a kind of queerly optimistic renewal to it. I could see the scow pointed like a nail file at the pleasures of the great open sea, that it would stop for me, that you and I should sample the disjointedness of a far from level deck, and then return someday through the torn orange veils of an early evening that will know our names only in a different pronunciation, and then, and only then, might the prophet-taking of spring arrive. So, for me, I think April Galleons makes legible the vital principle that even in the context of this deadly pandemic, those affected can still, as Robert Vasquez Pacheco put it, he was an HIV-positive activist, is a HIV-active positive activist and poet, who is one of the figures in this really iconic image by Grant Fury. He wrote, you know, even in this context, people can do things like hope and dream and even love, in the conviction that love is not loss, that friendship is not desertion, that long-term relationships with other gay men are not exercises in futility. For Ashbery, this means imagining multiple pasts, presents and futures, rich with possibilities for mitigating the heteronormative directive to fall out dumbly, to join the general direction at the appointed time, and crucially, for preserving in some form the story of how we were and how we were meant to be. Thanks.